This argument has how many conclusions?
2.
2 conclusions. So it says, in all cultures, it is almost universally accepted that one has a moral duty to prevent members of one's family from being harmed. Okay. We just have to accept that as fact. We know that's a premise because the next word says thus, right? So we have something, thus, something. This has to be a premise, and that has to be a conclusion because of the word thus, right? Now, the next word is what? After this second sentence. Hence. And because this is hence, we know that this is a conclusion, which makes that what? It's got to be an intermediate conclusion because it's both a premise and a conclusion at the same time, right? Remember, hence points back to a premise and forward to a conclusion. Thus points back to a premise and forward to a conclusion. So since this is both a premise and a conclusion, this is an intermediate conclusion. Why am I telling you all this? Because on the LSAT, you have to accept premises as true, but you do not have to accept conclusions. So when the author went from this premise to this conclusion, I was like, wait a sec, here's a flaw. Just because everyone accepts the idea that you should protect your family members from harm does not mean that everyone thinks you should hide them from the police. I hope that was an obvious leap. What is this person assuming about hiding someone from the police?
Protects your family members from harm.
Yeah, that protects them from harm. That is true in some cases, right? For sure. But there are certainly cases where hiding them from the police would not be protecting them from harm. In fact, it might be harmful. So you turn them in, and that's maybe the safest, least harmful route to go. So that's flaw number 1. Flaw number 2, when you go from this conclusion, intermediate conclusion, to this conclusion, which is now the main conclusion, does it have to be true that if some people would find it right to hide their children from the police, that it is also likely to be widely accepted that it is sometimes morally right to obstruct the police in their work? I actually felt like this conclusion wasn't so bad if you accept this intermediate conclusion as true, right? If it's true that most people would want to hide their children from the police, then yes, sometimes it's morally right to obstruct the police in their work. The assumption is what? If you hide your children from the police, then you're
Obstructing their work.
obstructing the police. That's the assumption. I think that's a really reasonable assumption. I think if you're hiding someone from the police, you're obstructing their work. That makes sense. And notice this has a weak word. What weak word? Sometimes. So I feel like although there's a leap in logic from here to here and from here to here, I feel like the biggest leap is right here. And this is the biggest leap. Which answers were we debating?
C.
A, C, and hopefully B? Okay, let's talk about it. Utilizes a single type of example for the purpose of justifying a broad generalization. Yes. Do you guys remember the 2 questions you want to ask yourself?
Is it happening?
Is it happening? Is it a problem, right? So let's talk about it. Is it happening? Is it utilizing a single type of example? Yes. It's just this one thing about hiding kids from the police. For the purpose of justifying a broad generalization. I don't know if that's such a problem. Right? Notice you're going from here to here. Remember, the conclusion said, it is also likely to be widely accepted that it is sometimes morally right to obstruct the police in their work. By using that word sometimes, this is not saying that it's most of the time or all the time or usually or anything. It's just there is at least one occasion where people would be like, yes, it's okay to obstruct the police in their work. So if answer choice A is describing what's happening, and I'm not sure that it is because I don't think this is a broad generalization, even if it is describing what's happening, I don't think that's the biggest problem in this argument. Are we okay with that? Anyone still like, no, this is right. I'm going to tell you why in 2 pages, single space. Okay, well, let me know. Answer choice B, fails to consider the possibility. Okay, so the question is, does it fail to consider this possibility? That other moral principles would be widely recognized as overriding any obligation to protect a family member from harm. If this is possible, if other moral principles override this one obligation, then that would create a problem from here to here, right? So I would keep this one open. Answer choice C, presumes without providing justification. What does that mean? Necessarily assumes. So does this argument have to assume that allowing the police to arrest an innocent person assists rather than obstructs justice? I don't think this actually has to be assumed because this feels like a false contrapositive. They're assuming that if you hide someone, what's happening? You're obstructing justice. Does that mean that if you're not hiding them, that you're not obstructing? Right? They're assuming that, hey, if you hide someone, you're obstructing. This is actually one of the flaws we talked about. We're like, hey, is that a flaw? I don't think that's a flaw because that seems pretty reasonable. But does that mean that if you don't hide them, you're not obstructing? That if you what is it? If you allow the police to arrest, if you allow them, that you're assisting them, that you're not obstructing. That's a false contrapositive. So I don't think this assumption is even being made. So question number 1, is this happening? No. Question number 2, is this a problem? I would say no again, because even if this is happening, I don't think this is a really problematic assumption. Right? Assuming that hiding is obstructing seems to make a lot of sense to me. If you said, whoa, I don't think hiding is obstructing, I'd be really interested to hear your argument for that. Because hiding seems like the definition of obstructing. I'm trying to find something. It's hidden. So, I don't think it's happening, but even if it were, I don't think it's a problem. Cool? All right, any other answers that we're attempting? Anyone tempted by D or E? Does anyone know why E is wrong? It's true. What does that mean? It is described in the intermediate conclusion with the word if. They said, if a person is known by the parents to be falsely accused. So the argument is just saying, if that's the case, we don't care whether it is or not. It's just saying, in those circumstances, then this is what will happen. Yeah, Will.
So they don't care about truth value, they just want to know what it is.
They don't care whether it's true or not. We don't need to make this assumption because it's just like, well, in those cases where it is true, this is what's going to happen. They're not talking about the cases in which it's not true. And so even if you came back and said, hey, well, you're assuming that it is true. You're assuming that this is actually the case. You'd be like, well, no, I don't care whether it's the case or not, because my conclusion is just, if it is the case, then this is what's going to happen. That happens a lot, by the way, in conclusions. They'll put like if in it, and then it's like that becomes irrelevant because it's just like, well, if that happens, then this is my conclusion. If that doesn't happen, I don't have any opinion. All right. Any other questions on 67? Moral duty. Okay.